Would the tyranny that we've lived through the last couple of years, this COVID stuff, if we were to have adhered to the Constitution's original intent, would any of that look different? Whether how states responded or the government's recommendations?
Yeah. That's a huge topic. I'm going to touch on it somewhat briefly.
Yeah.
More brief than maybe
briefly is all we
deserve.
got time for.
That's fine. And, on the one hand, people will often say things are unconstitutional when they recognize it violates principles of liberty.
Yeah.
But under the U.S. Constitution, the states were free to do a lot of things that the federal government was not. Mm-hmm. So certain things might or might not be within state power. But separate from that, I want to focus on, when we're talking about constitutionality, the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah.
And in that regard, what the federal government did in response, I think, is where I want to focus my commentary.
There'd be no DPHHS, for instance, right?
Now that's
so we have no Fauci sitting up and
there's no Fauci, there's no gain of function research, and would it have ever been a pandemic in the first place?
Would there be a CDC?
No. Yeah, there shouldn't be a CDC.
No CDC guidelines.
No HHS.
Fauci.
So there's no national guidelines. There's none of this.
Yeah. Well, this sounds like chaos, Robert. Who's gonna take care of us?
It's called freedom. And Thomas Jefferson talked about he'd much rather hazard the dangers of too much freedom than go through the tyranny of too little freedom. And that's a very rough paraphrase. He said it much more eloquently. But I totally agree with that a little bit of having a little too much freedom is really a good thing.
Can we handle too much freedom today?
And now one of the things here, and that's a great question. I wanted to expand on that question. If the federal government wasn't involved in our schools and healthcare and all these different things, it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It doesn't mean we won't have schools.
Right.
It doesn't mean we're not going to have healthcare. It just means it's not their jurisdiction.
Right. It was never in the first place.
It was never supposed to be. And if things were in state jurisdiction or even local jurisdiction, it creates much more competition. Let's take, for example, the Obamacare, as it's nicknamed. National Health Care Act.
Yeah.
No constitutional authority to have that. I'll go against the Supreme Court on that one. But what it was supposed to be is on the state level, if at all. And, of course, Obamacare was modeled after Romney Care, as it was nicknamed, Massachusetts version, which was a failure already, and they still decided to model it after it. Mm-hmm. If, instead of that, we had allowed competition between the states, keeping this at the state level, let's say, for example, that Wisconsin looks at the Massachusetts model and say, well, that didn't work very well. Let's do a different model that at least doesn't bankrupt the state. Mm-hmm. Right, literally, Massachusetts had to get bailouts from the federal government to keep it going. It was that bad. And so let's say Wisconsin comes up with their model that is at least financially stable. Still not perfect. And then, of course, my state in Utah, we come up with the even better model that starts bringing healthcare costs down. And other states are looking at these three models and, well, the Utah model is better than the other two. And then, say, Arizona comes up with one that even improves upon Utah's and so on. That competition is healthy. Whereas one size fits all for the entire country, and we're going to make that one size the failed model out of Massachusetts. That's exactly the worst way we could do it.
Well, without like a competition, there's no reason to improve. The DMV is always mentioned. Why is the DMV? The DMV is the only place, right? You can get your driver's license and all this stuff. There's no other place, and so you walk in there and lollygagging around. There's a big line, and I think that's really reflective of what happens when there's no competition, and that's why nearly everything by government is run so badly. There is no competition. They have nothing to lose. Your taxpayers are going into their pockets regardless. It's tragic.